Hi, Misha here, and this is one I was planning on doing before, or maybe right after the holidays, but for a couple of various reasons, I did not. Sorry. I'm going to take a little brief look at the new Hobbymaster Russian Air Force MiG-29, and this is the 29S variant. As far as I know, this is the first time Hobbymaster has done the MiG-29. But as you know, they've done the 15, the 17, the 21, the 23, and the 25. Interestingly, not the 19, though. And no, they haven't done a 31 or a 35. Sorry. In the past, I showed you this aircraft. This is another Russian Air Force MiG-29. This one's from JC Wings. And here is a Polish MiG-29UB 2-seat. Also from JC Wings. Yeah, so we just kind of talk about it briefly. I'm not probably going to go too far into depth because I've got a lot to do tonight, but worth mentioning. For any of us that grew up in the 80s, the MiG-29 is the quintessential bad guy aircraft. In the 1960s, air combat was changing. In the 50s, it was all about higher and faster, and more emphasis was placed on missiles, less on guns, cannon. But when it came time to design the 4th generation fighter jets, it was realized that sometimes low altitude and maneuverability and even old-fashioned guns were still the way to go. The experiences in Vietnam between various American aircraft like the F-100, F-105, and the MiG-17 and MiG-21 showed this early on. Later, of course, the F-4 would be very popular. And to this end, the U.S. Air Force would start the FX fighter program, and of course the Navy would have their own, and this would result in a whole generation of fighters in America. The F-15, designed specifically for air superiority, air-to-air. The F-16 is a less expensive multi-purpose alternative. And then in the Navy you have the F-14 Tomcat, again designed to be air-to-air. And later would be upgraded to give it some ground attack capability. Well, Russia couldn't be left behind. So in 1969, the Soviet General Staff ordered a new air superiority fighter. And they really were ambitious. They quite recently put the MiG-23 into full production. And at times it was proving less than great. I'm not saying the MiG-23 was a failure, but let's just say it left something to be desired. So they really wanted the new aircraft to be long range, able to take off from austere runways, airfields, operate from them, carry a large weapons payload, be able to do Mach 2 plus. So kind of a one-size-fits-all. Well, by 1971 they realized this wasn't practical. So the program was basically split into a long-range strategic fighter and a light tactical fighter. Now the long-range strategic fighter, that project would be given to Sukhoi and would result in the Su-27. And the light tactical would be given to MiG. and would result in the MiG-29 here. Just to switch focus, why not? The MiG-29 prototype would first fly. I should say that development began in earnest in 1974, and already by 1977 they had a prototype ready, which first flew in October of 1977. And then they would go back and make some improvements and updates, and then begin to put it into full rate production in 1981, and it would be accepted into Soviet VVS service in the summer of 1982, with full rate and full acquirement happening by 1983. Now the initial version was the MiG-29A, and this was for Soviet use. There was also an export version with kind of downgraded systems known as the MiG-29B, and in the West these are designated as the Fulcrum A to be exact for these early versions. There was also a two-seat version, the MiG-29UB, designated as the Fulcrum B. And this would primarily be used as a trainer, although the U could be armed. And it really, even though they had, some satellite surveillance photographs and other bits of espionage, it wasn't until 1986 that people at the West really got to get a up-close and personal look at the MiG-29 at a Finnish air show. And then in 1988 and 1989, the Soviets would show these off in France and Britain. It was a very interesting fighter for its time. It's a little under 57 feet long, with a wingspan of a little over 37 feet. Max speed near sea level is about 1.3 Mach, and at high altitudes it can achieve over 2.2 Mach. It can get up to about 59,000 feet. And the idea behind the light tactical fighter, the elements that this embodied, was to be agile, maneuverable, able to operate from short or austere runways, essentially a short-range dogfighter. What it lacked that the Sukhoi had, it did not have especially great range, and it had some kind of legacy hardware. For example, it has a very similar, originally had a very similar cockpit layout to the MiG-23, but it did have kind of better visibility thanks to newer canopy style. Still yet, the situational awareness could have been better. It also ended up inheriting the radar system initially for the A model from the 23. They were going to go for a whole new radar, but for various complications they didn't originally. So even as the A's were coming into service, MiG was working on this version here as an upgrade, the S. It really was a good step forward. It's often called the fatback, as it has a hump on top. This houses electronic countermeasures, a jamming pod essentially. It also gives more internal space for fuel to help improve the range. They also strengthened the airframe so it could carry now up to 4,000 kilograms in ordnance. The MiG-29 has a 30mm cannon Early on, interestingly, it could not be used if a center line fuel tank was used because of how the shells were ejected, but later with the S they would correct this. They would also eventually add additional plumbing for up to 3 external fuel tanks, or we have a total of 7 hard points, 3 under each wing and 1 center line. The Russian version could carry tactical nuclear weapons. The export version, the B, could not. The S also had a new radar and a better cockpit, and it would be known in the West as the Fulcrum C. And a little confusingly, the export version would be known as the MiG-29C. So this was in Soviet service when the fall of the Soviet Union happened. And after that, not a lot happened. In the early 21st century, the VVS chose to modernize other planes like the MiG-31 and its Sukhoi fleet. So the MiG-29 was kind of left to age. In fact, by 2008, nearly half of the fleet was grounded and pretty much not serviceable. Some planes were restored, others were too far gone, too deteriorated. They wanted to upgrade to the most modern version at the time, the MiG-29 SMT, but there just wasn't a lot of funding. Then there was talks about just replacing the MiG-29 back in 2013, but there wasn't enough funding for that either. So in 2014, Mishaco was contracted with to produce 16 brand new MiG-29 SMTs for the Russian Air Force, and these first saw use in Syria in 2017. But really in the 21st century, the MiG-29 in Russian service has been plagued with a spotty service record, and it's mostly just because the planes were allowed to get outdated, training standards fell, and emphasis was placed more on the Sukhoi line. It was just allowed to kind of fall out of date. But that still doesn't mean that it was a bad plane. In fact, newer versions, like the M and SMT, have been given ground attack capability, a new radar able to target on the ground, and use with newer air-to-surface ordnance. They've also started integrating modern color displays in the cockpit and even glass cockpits. And these are still officially in production today, with over 1,600 built so far. So what about in Poland? Well, Poland is interesting, because for a while it was the largest user of the MiG-29 in NATO. It tried out, the Polish military tried out this aircraft at the end of communism around 1988. And the first dozen were delivered to Poland by 1990. It was 9 of the single seat and 3 of the 2-seat models. And then after the end of communism in both Russia and Poland, another 10 would be acquired from former Czechoslovakia, then Czech Republic in the mid-90s. Most of these were the single seat, so they would have 22 in service come the 21st century. And actually, as they retired their MiG-21s and their MiG-23s, this was pretty much their standard frontline fighter, and to some extent the only one they really had for a while. Of course, more recently they've purchased F-16s as well, but yeah. And then in 2004, they would buy 22 old used surplus examples from former East Germany, now Germany, Of these, they were able to refurbish and get 14 flying again. The rest were just kept for spare parts. And then in 2011, the Polish government issued a contract to upgrade and modernize their MiG-29 fleet. And by 2017, they had 31 flying examples in service. Of these, 25 are the single seat, and 6 are the 2-seat, like this one here. Unfortunately, while they've had an excellent safety record to this point in Poland, 2017 ended with the first MiG-29 crash in the Polish military, and it was followed by 2 more crashes, one in 2018 and one in 2019, showing that even with a competent military, they may just be aging out of practical use. But again, this aircraft dates back to the late 70s, early 80s, and it was always kind of a lightweight, tactical fighter. It seems like in Russia, the Sukhoi's getting all the glory now. Who knows if that'll change or whatnot, but it is what it is. So what about the 2 JC wings versus the new Hobbymaster? Well, I prefer Hobbymaster. But when I was getting my MiG collection up to snuff, they did not do a MiG-29. So I eventually buckled down and grabbed this JC wings. And it wasn't a week later that Hobbymaster announced they would be doing a MiG-29. So, great. Oh well. After that, making sure they would not be doing a 2-seat at Hobbymaster for some time, I went ahead and bought the Polish version here on sale when I found it. 1, because 2 seats are cool, and 2, Polish is cool. Anyway, that was almost a year ago, and this came in finally. It was scheduled for November. It came in December. This is the first version. They are also planning to do an East German variant and a Polish single-seat variant this year, 2020. So what do I think? Okay, positives for the JC wing. The whole thing is essentially metal. The body, the tail fins, vertical and horizontal. You can also move various components like the air brake and the rudders. However, I've noticed JC wings tend to not be as durable as some other models. And sometimes their ordnance or gear can be hard to get in and out, or don't always want to stay in that well. And their quality control can be hit or miss, although it seems like more recently they've upped their quality control game. Also, their paint and their detailing, while good, is maybe not as great as it could be. But again, for a while they were the game in town for MiGs, unless you wanted to go with an old Whitty, which these are actually just built on Whitty tooling. The problem with the Whitties, they usually have gear down and non-removable pilots. At least the JC gives you gear up or down. You do have to buy the stand. It's a pretty neat stand. It's all metal. But it's also kind of got a weird shaped base, so it's not the most stable in the world. On the other hand, it plugs into the engines, meaning you can have the fuel tank underneath if you want. I don't on this one, but I do on the Polish. So I would say the biggest negative for me is that it's a somewhat fragile model on a somewhat unstable stand. But if you're careful, it shouldn't be too big of an issue. Hobbymaster positives. Very stable stand. The one it comes with is actually one of their metal stem ones, and it actually plugs in as opposed to cradle, which I always like when they do that. They're that way with most of their Sukhois too, and some of their MiGs. So good stable stand with a metal thing, although the base is still plastic. The ordnance plugged into the wings. It took a little bit of, pressure to pop them in, but when they did, they popped in very well. Nice, tight enough, but not too tight. Of course, cockpit can be opened or closed, and pilot can be in or out. Gear up or down. And Hobbymaster has always been really good with their detail level and their paint seams. Yes, I know it's schemes, but yeah. And they tend to be really durable models for what they are. I'm not saying give them to your kids to play with, but I've had a few Hobbymasters survive a fall. And their plastic seems to have a little more flexibility to it. Like if the Pytot tube were to get bent, you can usually bend them back with Hobbymaster if you're patient. With the JC, they just snap off. On the other hand, JCs ship their airplanes usually with the Pytot tubes separate, so you plug them in, whereas the Hobbymasters are usually pre-installed. Sometimes they're actually a physical piece with the nose. There's not as much metal in this Hobbymaster. Talking about, perhaps negatives. The tail fins are plastic. Of course, the wings and the main body are still metal. Now, one benefit to doing on plastic is you can get more detail. So it's kind of a thing. Better looking, but not as metal. And also, of course, the Hobbymasters cost more. Although lately the JCs have been creeping up to being almost as expensive. Used to you could get a JC for $60. Now they're creeping up to 70 and even 80, and so whereas the Hobbymaster is 90 to 100. And it does come with a stand, whereas the JC you have to add about $10 to get your stand if you want it. So it's up to you which you prefer. And I think both are nice. Both are definitely superior to the older Witty. But to only pick one, I would definitely, if you can afford it, say the Hobbymaster. Especially as they continue to expand the line. Hopefully we'll get a MiG-35. I didn't talk about it in this video because I'm hoping we'll get one eventually and then I can do a whole video on it, but it probably won't be for a long while because they've only released this one model so far. Alrighty guys, that's about what I have to say tonight on this. If you have any questions or comments, please do post them. What do you think? Which one you prefer? And if you like, check out my couple other MiG-29 videos. It's a fun plane. With that said, this is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.